Hello, my name is Ayelet Connell and I'm a gluten-free and paleo chef, and this is an episode of Simply Paleo with me. So today we're going to be learning how to make beef stew, hearty and nourishing and delicious beef stew. And what's great about this recipe is you can really vary the ingredients according to what's in your pantry and what's in your kitchen, but it gives you a basic understanding of how to create a stew. And it's paleo in the sense that we don't create a roux out of flour to thicken it. We actually use potatoes. And for those of you that are following more of an autoimmune paleo protocol and can't eat potatoes because they're in the nightshade family, then generally I'll put in some rutabaga, which is a little bit starchier and helps to thicken it. And sometimes I'll also create a roux, but more out of cassava flour or tapioca starch, something that's AIP friendly, and that can help to thicken it. And we'll talk about that when we get to that point. So let's get started. So we've got a big soup pot. And I certainly don't make this whole thing filled with beef stew, but what's great about using a bigger pot is that when it's halfway filled and it's bubbling and boiling, you're not getting it spritzing all over your kitchen. So we're going to put it on the stove, and we're going to light the gas stove, and we're going to put it to medium high, and we're going to put a little bit of olive oil in because we want to caramelize onions. So we're going to put about a tablespoon or two of olive oil, and we're going to heat that up. And then what you would do is take an onion and you're going to chop it into small bite-sized pieces. You see I've done that here, and it's about a medium-sized onion. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add it to the oil, and generally I'll wait till the oil is a little bit hot because it helps to caramelize it. But these gas stoves heat up pretty quick, and that's the onion. And then we're just going to stir it a bit and help to coat the onion in the oil. And we're going to let it sit for a bit and start to caramelize. We'll hear that sizzle, and we'll know we need to stir a little bit. The next ingredient we want to use is stew beef. Now, stew beef can be a lot of different things. We belong to, we get a side of beef every year, a side of grass-fed beef from a wonderful farm up in Dorset, Vermont. It's called Vermont Natural Beef, and they deliver the beef to us every year. So we have a lot of grass-fed beef. We actually have a standing freezer in our garage bay, and everything's packaged beautifully. And so we get a lot of stew beef. And also a lot of chuck roast and a lot of ground beef, and then of course all the wonderfully more refined steaks. But this is so fantastic, and there you can see that they're just really kind of standardized size cubes of beef, and some of them have a little bit of fat or cartilage, but very minimal. I already went through the pack. It's about a pound of beef, and I discarded the ones that had a lot of fat on them. And not to say that the fat isn't healthier because it's grass-fed, because it is. But when you're making the stew, it can get a little tough on the outside and give it a little bit of a funny rubbery texture because it's been cooked in the soup for so long. So this is our stew beef. You can also cut the chunks smaller if you want them to be smaller bite-sized pieces. But the key is when you're making any kind of meat dish is to really have the meat at room temperature, because what happens is when they hit the heat of the pot or the pan, if they're cold, then they just sort of contract, and it makes the beef that much tougher. So if you can have it at room temperature, that's ideal. The other thing that's really great to do is to salt it. And so I have it pretty much in a single layer here on the plate, and I'm just going to take some sea salt and even a little bit of cracked pepper, and I'm just going to season the meat, and then I'm just going to turn it over so I can get the other sides, and do that again. I'm not using a ton of salt because I'm going to put salt in the stew, but just a little bit to season it itself. And I can hear the onions sizzling, and so I'm just going to give it a stir, and I'm going to actually add the meat. So the onions are going to caramelize while the meat is cooking, but sometimes I'll also just let the onions caramelize first before I add the meat. But in essence of time for this cooking video, we're going to do them together. And so the idea is we're browning the meat. So we want to get all surfaces of the meat to be cooked on the outside, and it's going to help to seal in the juices and the tenderness of the stew beef, while at the same time we're softening the onions. Now if you were to just cook the onions in the soup, they would get soft as well. But when you caramelize the onions, it really brings about this wonderful, rustic, slightly sweet flavor to the onions. And they just become that much more delicious. So we're going to let that cook, And what we're going to do is chop our other vegetables. So, as I said, if you're following a paleo diet, but you're not in an autoimmune paleo, you can use potatoes. And potatoes are great because they really help, white potatoes are great because they really help to thicken the stew. So sometimes I'll just get a big russet potato and I'll peel it and I'll chop it into bite-sized pieces, and that'll be what I use for my potato. And other times I'll get these little fingerling potatoes that are sort of a mixture, and it gives us a nice colorful texture, and I usually leave the skin on because they're such a thin skin, it's not rough at all. And I'll literally chop them into bite-sized pieces. So you can see they're little. And you know, it's really a preference. You can have big chunks, you can have little chunks, but the smaller they are, the quicker it cooks. But if you have the time to really let the stew sit on a simmer for several hours, and you're going to get a really delicious melding of flavors, and things are going to be much softer, and it's going to have more of that nourishing feel. But alternatively to the potatoes, if you're following an autoimmune paleo protocol or an AIP diet, and you can't eat white potatoes because they're considered a nightshade, which is a food that you avoid on the AIP diet, then you can create a roux to thicken. And what you would do is, after the meat has browned, you can take the meat out and the onions out, and there's still some oil in there and some drippings from the meat. You can put a little bit more olive oil in and maybe a tablespoon or two of cassava flour or tapioca starch, and get a whisk in there and whisk it really well so it thickens, and then you can add some stock in and stir again just to make sure everything is smooth consistency, and then you can add your meat in and start to put all the other ingredients in. The other option also is to add a rutabaga, and rutabagas are a little bit starchier. They're not quite as starchy as a potato, a white potato is, but they will help to thicken. And so rutabagas, they kind of look, this is a purple top turnip, which you can also add in. Rutabaga is larger than this type of a turnip, and it usually has a little bit of a glossier and more kind of mottled look to it. But the inside of the rutabaga, you can see I peeled it, has a little bit of this yellowish tint to it, and the turnip is more of a white color. So for this stew, I'm going to use turnips and rutabagas, and I'm not going to do the roux because I have time in my kitchen to let the stew just simmer for a while, and it's going to reduce and thicken on its own. But generally, I might use just a mixture of different types of white potatoes, different skinned white potatoes. Okay, so we're just stirring this to let the different surfaces of the stew be brown, and the onions are definitely caramelizing, and you can smell that wonderful fragrance. And so now what we're going to do is chop some more vegetables. And so we've got our celery that's been washed and patted dry. And a lot of times what I'll do is I'll just start from the top. I'll take one little layer off to just discard all the dried off ends. And then what I'll do is I'll just keep the bottom of the celery intact, and I will just cut from the top so I can get all those beautiful leaves, but it's a nice easy way to do it. And then I kind of leave the bottom half of the head of celery so I can use for things like chicken salad and tuna salad and things where chopped celery is so delicious in. You could be making even a tabbouleh style salad using cauliflower rice, and little diced chopped celery is just wonderful. So, and the smell of chopped celery is so fragrant, it's delicious. So we're going to add it to our bowl of vegetables. Now generally, and this is definitely my upbringing in the kitchen, my grandmother, Terry, taught me early on when we were making soups and stews that one of the greatest ways to really develop layers of flavor and depth of flavor is to put one ingredient into the stew or the soup at a time and let it come up to a boil in between adding each ingredient. And it's sort of something that a lot of us might take for granted, but it really does help to develop that depth of flavor. Now, there are definitely times when I have not had the time. You know, maybe I have, you know, my kiddos are at home and they're starving, and my husband and I are home from work maybe a little later, and we just don't have the time to spend hours, and we want to just make a quick soup or a quick stew, which is possible. But then you put everything in at once the onions are caramelized and the meat is browned. And then what you do is you keep it on a higher boil for longer and let it reduce quicker that way, and it's still delicious. It just has not quite the depth of flavor that it does when you take the time to nurture the stew. So we've got our celery and our rutabaga and turnip because we're going to avoid potatoes in this one, but certainly you can do the potatoes and it gives that more traditional but delicious texture and flavor. And then we've got our carrots. And you know, it really is such a personal preference how large the size of the carrots are. I particularly like them big and chunky. And I think, you know, it's easier for my kids to see them in the stew, and they love carrots, and so it makes for a really good textural component to the stew. And if you are taking the time to let the stew cook for a long time, and it's going to reduce and soften, the larger pieces of carrots are going to stay in that beautiful carrot shape, and they won't kind of fall apart and become more of like a mush, which I will say is still delicious to eat, but not as pretty to look at. So there is definitely aesthetic quality to the stew, and it's one of the reasons why I do larger chunks of the carrots, and it definitely has enough time to cook down and be soft, even though they're larger chunks. Sometimes I have those really massive carrots, like the kinds you use for juicing, that are really sweet, and even those I'll do in larger chunks. And it just gives it a nice texture to the stew, a nice little sweetness. So generally I'll do 6 to 8 carrots. It kind of depends on how large they are. But the proportions are central to what's in your kitchen. We typically have a big bag of organic carrots in our fridge at all times, and typically a big head of celery. And so that's always the easy part of the stew, and then comes in the question of the other things of whether we have them in our kitchen, if we have to run to the store, or if it's an afterthought. So there we go. So as you can see, I'm adding all the vegetables to this bowl, but generally I'll do just one ingredient at a time. And the meat is pretty much well browned and looking wonderfully plump. So what we're going to do is we're going to add in the liquid so we can bring it up to a boil. So I'm going to put in 2 quarts of beef broth. Now, you can absolutely use homemade beef broth, beef stock that you made at home, bone broth, and of course it'll make it have that much more nutritious value and depth of flavor. But for essence of time, and of course, sometimes we just don't have any stock because we finished it up the last time. You can definitely buy organic beef broth, or you can even nowadays find bone broth at the store, which is such a wonderful commodity. Because there are definitely times where we just don't have the time to cook bone broth at home because it's just a busy schedule. And we've run out of the last batch that we had. Okay, so we have 2 quarts of beef broth in here, and then we're going to put in about 1 quart of water, and ideally filtered water, because you're going to be eating this, and you want it to be the best quality, right? And what we're going to do is we're going to put this up on high. Because we want to bring it up to a boil. Okay, and then I'm going to go through the rest of the vegetables with you so you see what we've got. So we've got in here the rutabaga and the turnips, the celery and the chopped carrots. We also have some frozen veggies. So I generally like to use the peas because they have a little bit of a sweetness, and also frozen green beans. And they can be right out of the packet. You really don't need to thaw them at all because, of course, the soup is going to help to boil them and get them to be softer. And it's typically a pound package of each, or a 16-ounce package of each. But again, it's what you got in the kitchen and in the freezer, so it's a forgiving recipe for sure. And then in addition, we've got some dry seasoning and also some fresh herbs. So in this bowl, we've got some fresh parsley and fresh sage and some fresh rosemary. About a tablespoon of fresh parsley and about a teaspoon of fresh sage and fresh rosemary. And it's just so fragrant and delicious smelling. And we also have our bay leaves. I generally like to put 2 bay leaves in a large pot of stew. They're dried, and I will definitely say that you want to be a little bit cautious, because when you make the stew with these, they'll keep their shape and they're a little bit sharp. And so when you're done with cooking the stew, you want to look for the bay leaves and you want to take them out and discard them. They give a wonderful flavor and smell to the soup, but they're very hard to get down your throat, and it can be a little dangerous with choking and things like that. So just look for them and take them out. And so that's our bay leaves. You can certainly avoid them if you don't want to deal with that hassle, but they're wonderful for flavor. And then we also have some dried thyme. You can certainly use fresh thyme as well, but the dried thyme is beautiful and just as fragrant. So we're going to do about half a teaspoon of the thyme. And then, of course, we've got our salt and pepper, our sea salt, which has got a lot of wonderful minerals in it. And we've got what's called kombu. Now, kombu is a type of seaweed that I use in a lot of dishes. And sometimes it comes in a big sheet, and sometimes it comes in these sort of individually narrow pieces. And just going to give this a bit of a stir. And so you want to take about a thumb-sized piece or like an inch piece off. You really don't need a lot. And generally I'll just run it loosely under water just to get any kind of particles off of it. But what is kombu? Kombu is a type of seaweed, and when it's added to stews and soups, it helps to alkalinize it. It's got a lot of beautiful minerals to it, but it also gives a wonderful punch of flavor. And so I tend to put it in all the stews I make, all the soups I make, anything with a red sauce in it. I might make a vegetable soup that has like crushed tomatoes in it, and it helps to reduce the acidity of it, so that people that typically get heartburn with those types of foods, they typically have a lower reaction. And you can find it in most stores, but certainly in your natural food markets and your Whole Foods and that. So we can really stick this in right away. And why don't we put the other seasoning in while we're waiting for it to come up to a boil. So we've got our fresh herbs that we're going to put in. Okay. And we've got our dried thyme. We're going to put about half a teaspoon in. It's a pretty strong flavor, the dried thyme, so I usually put in a little less, but it still gives a nice added layering of flavor. We're going to put in our 2 bay leaves, and remember that we're going to be pulling them out before we eat. And then we're going to do about a teaspoon and a half of sea salt. You don't want to oversalt it, which I've certainly done in the past, and so I've cut down the amount of salt I put in, knowing that I can always add more if it's not salted enough. And then I'm going to put about a half a teaspoon of cracked pepper. Sometimes I'll add some crushed pepper flakes into the soup as well, maybe like a pinch of that. It gives it a little bit of a kick, but not much, not enough for my kids to notice. And again, if you're following an autoimmune paleo protocol and you're avoiding nightshades, you would avoid that as well. The other thing I sometimes put in is about a half a teaspoon of paprika, because it gives it a little bit of a smoked flavor. But if you're following the AIP, you want to avoid it. And then I'm also going to add about a tablespoon of lemon juice, which I always do with my soups and stews, and that could be the Israeli in me, that lemon part of every dish, but it just adds a little bit more depth of flavor. And then the other component I'm going to add in is some whole grain mustard. So you can see all the seeds, they're still in there, so that's a little bit of a textural piece that I love. But you can also use just regular Dijon mustard. This is a whole grain Dijon mustard, but either way I typically put in about a tablespoon or even 2 teaspoons worth, and it just gives a nice little kind of tart kick to the stew and helps to give it more of a robust flavor. All right, so it's coming up to a boil, and so what I'm going to do is I'm going to add the veggies that are fresh into the stew, and then generally what I would do is I would bring it up to a boil again, and then I would put in the frozen veggies. But for the video's sake, I'm going to just add everything in and then let it come up to a boil with everything together. Now sometimes it's not enough liquid for all the vegetables, and so then you might add in some more filtered water. But you don't want it to go too high because you really want it to reduce and you want it to thicken. And if there's too much liquid in it, then it's not going to cook down to be as thick. So you really want to keep it to that ratio. And if you find that it's still too liquidy, you can add more vegetables, and that can help to create it. So then what you do is you bring it up to a boil, and then you lower it to a simmer, and you just let it cook. And you let it cook for a while and periodically stir it to make sure that you're getting kind of a nice, consistent, even heating of all the elements of the stew. And you don't want it to be over boiling, but certainly a small amount of boils every, several minutes or 20 minutes or 30 minutes, depending on if you're on the couch reading a book or doing one of the other myriad of things you have to do in your day. Just remember to stir it periodically. And if you really are needing to have this be a quicker recipe, then my suggestion is to keep it on a higher boil and really monitor it, and make sure you're stirring it well, and it'll be ready within an hour and a half probably. So that is the recipe. And so now what I want to do is taste test some of the stew that I made earlier, and show you kind of how it looks when it's all cooked down. Let me just wash this spoon. It has the mustard on it. And you can see here it has all the different types of potatoes, because this stew I made with the fingerling potatoes, and it's got the big chunks of beef, and you can see the big pieces of carrot and the peas and the green beans. Oh, it's so, so fragrant. So we're going to take a taste test and see what we got going on here. Got a little bit of everything in this bite. We want a perfect bite. Got a little bit of every vegetable and some meat. That is so delicious. Oh my goodness. Nourishing, rustic flavors. You've got the potatoes are in the stew that we're making now, the rutabaga, which is a little bit of a different type of flavor profile for sure. I can taste the fragrance and the flavor from all the different fresh herbs and the dried herbs, the thyme I can smell, the little bit of the tartness and kick from the lemon juice and the mustard. I can actually see some of the mustard seeds in here, and it is just so flavorful. So I hope you try this at home. It's a wonderful recipe. It's really easy to make. You just need to have all of your foraged vegetables ready there to be chopped, and just put it in the pot. And if you have the time and you want to try to create more of that depth of flavor, then really put one ingredient in at a time and bring it up to a boil, and then bring in the next ingredient and so on. And when you're at that final boil of the last ingredient that you added, you can lower it to a low boil, simmer, and just let it sit, stir it periodically. And it doesn't need to be covered because you want it to reduce. So if you cover it, you're going to keep all that liquid inside, and you want some of it to evaporate. And if you really have the time, give it several hours, and you'll find the most delicious, nourishing beef stew. So I hope you make it, and I hope you enjoy the recipe. And as always, I love to hear from you. So please, you can check out my website and blog at simplypaleo.com, and you can email me through the website with any ideas you have for future Simply Paleo episodes of things you'd love to figure out how to eat that are more paleo friendly, or just ideas or thoughts or questions, and I'd love to answer them for you. And thanks so much for tuning in.